The air smelled like swamp rot and concrete dust as I stood right where my backyard used to be. Across from me, Marie from the HOA was losing her mind, yelling at a city inspector while her pre-2000 McMansion sank another inch into the soggy earth. Squad cars sat parked with their flood warnings blaring. Frogs croaked like they were calling the shots from the flooded lawns. And somewhere off in the swampy mess, an old rusted mailbox floated by, looking like it was part of some sad little funeral parade. Yep, that's me. And if you're wondering how I ended up in the middle of this mess, well, I never expected that little creek behind my house to turn into a full-blown battleground. But here we are. That skinny trickle of water used to be my retreat. My reward after long days crawling under houses and welding pipes. I'd plop down in a worn-out folding chair next to the creek, crack open a beer in one hand, hold a fishing rod in the other, even though I never caught more than a nosy little bluegill. Dragonflies zipped through the tall reeds, the air smelled like fresh-cut grass, and the only sound at night was that soft burble of water sneaking through the rocks. It was peaceful. Sacred even. The kind of peace you don't mess with. Then the HOA showed up. Technically, they'd always been there, just across the other side of the development, tucked into their beige clone houses with matching mailboxes and eerily identical pumpkin displays every October. Out by the creek, we were the originals. The leftovers from when this place was all fields and dirt roads. But borders got redrawn, neighborhoods got swept up, and before we knew it, the HOA slithered its way into our lives like an oil slick. I got my first taste of the madness one sticky Saturday morning, when this woman, Marie Sanders, showed up on my porch. She had a clipboard clutched to her chest like it was a shield, dressed in pastel workout gear, even though it didn't look like she'd broken a sweat in years. Her smile? About as friendly as an IRS audit. She introduced herself as the HOA's Community Standards Chair. I told her I was busy. She didn't care. Marie had concerns about my property, specifically about my creek. She said it was an unauthorized water feature and a potential danger to kids and local wildlife. I just stared at her like she'd accused my dog of money laundering or something. The creek was natural. It had been there long before we showed up with our mortgages and our zero-turn lawnmowers. It belonged here, just like the trees and the rocks. But Marie? She didn't care about any of that. Marie had rules. Rules about fencing off water features, rules about standing water, rules about what your backyard was supposed to look like. Just rules. I told her, calmly, that the creek was a protected drainage channel. It was right there in my deed and backed by county code. But she just scribbled something angry on her clipboard and stormed off, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and pure frustration. 2 days later, I found a violation notice stuck to my door with blue painter's tape. It said I had unauthorized landscaping, unsafe open water, and, get this, was attracting non-native species. Apparently frogs now counted as illegal immigrants. I ignored it. A week after that, I got a second notice. This one came with a fine, $100 a day, unless I handed over a plan to bring my property into compliance. So I wrote back, quoted county law, and attached a land survey proving the creek's status. Their response? They scheduled an inspection. And that's when 3 strangers I'd never seen before showed up at my door wandering around my backyard like they were CSI agents or something, measuring everything with tape and snapping pictures on their phones like they were building a case for The Hague. Marie hovered at the property line, tapping her foot like I was wasting her time. I just stood there with my arms crossed, silently daring them to step 1 foot into that creek. They didn't, of course. But they sure wrote a lot of notes. A week later, there was a mandatory HOA meeting, the kind I usually wouldn't be caught dead at. But this time, I showed up. Marie stood in front of a room full of neighbors who mostly looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She cleared her throat and announced that my creek was an imminent safety hazard. She rambled on about insurance liability, breeding mosquitoes, attracting wildlife, and how erosion might one day damage nearby property. The fact that we all lived next to a literal swamp didn't seem to bother her one bit. I stood up to speak, and she gave me this sugary sweet smile like she'd already won. Then she handed me a thick stack of paperwork. According to her, I had 3 options: build a fence around the entire creek, fill it in completely, or allow the HOA to do weekly inspections for the next 12 months, at my own expense. I smiled back just as sweet and told her, in the most polite way I could manage, exactly where she could shove that paperwork. That's when things really started to spiral. Suddenly, I was getting anonymous complaints stuck to my front door every other day. Stuff about overgrown landscaping, not maintaining proper standards, nonsense like that. Then my mailbox got knocked clean off its post. No note, no accident, just gone. And one morning, someone dumped a pile of landscaping rocks right into the shallow part of the creek. It made the water back up and push against the banks, just enough to cause a little trouble. I even caught Marie herself, parked across the street in her SUV with the engine running, snapping pictures from behind the windshield like some kind of neighborhood PI. But I wasn't about to give in. I kept that creek just the way it was, natural, flowing, peaceful. I trimmed the reeds, cleared the debris, made sure the water kept moving. That was my land, my water, and I had every right to sit beside it in peace. I should have known they wouldn't stop there. It happened early on a Wednesday. I was sitting on the back porch, sipping my coffee, when I heard this deep, low rumble. At first, I figured it was city crews finally fixing that crater up on Maple Drive. But the sound kept getting closer. Way too close. I stood up just in time to see a cement truck easing its way down the narrow alley between my house and the one next door. A guy in a neon vest and a hard hat was walking alongside it, guiding the driver like he was backing in a luxury car. He kept yelling over the engine noise, signaling with big hand motions. I jumped up and ran down the steps, cutting across the yard just as they lined the chute up, right over the top curve of my creek. "Hey!" I yelled, waving my arms. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The guy in the vest barely looked at me. "Just following orders, sir. Drainage mitigation project. Approved by the HOA." Before I could say another word, the chute dropped, and thick, gray concrete started pouring out. I lost it, charged forward, slipped in the wet grass, and hit the ground hard. Scraped my arm on the way down. By the time I scrambled back up, that wet sludge was already spreading like poison, coating the rocks, drowning the reeds, choking the life out of the water. Frogs leapt away. In panic, but some weren't fast enough. They got stuck in the mess, twitching as it hardened around them. The driver kept the drum spinning, no hurry at all. Just calmly filling in the whole upper bend of the creek. The vest guy looked over his clipboard and gave a little nod, like it was just another day at work. I screamed at them to stop. I demanded to see paperwork. I told them they were trespassing, that this was my land. They ignored me. By the time they packed up and drove off, the creek, my beautiful little creek, was reduced to this ugly, concrete scar. Just a dead, lifeless ditch that ran all the way across my yard. I stood there, covered in mud and blood, just staring at the mess they'd made of what used to be the heart of my home. Marie stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, a smug little grin on her face like she'd just won some game of chess I didn't even know we were playing. I wiped the mud out of my eyes, straightened up, and gave her a smile right back. Let her have this round. She had no idea what kind of storm she just kicked up. When the first rain came, it almost felt like a relief. After that long, dry summer, it was nice to see the sky rolling in, a blanket of gray that brought a cool, refreshing flood to the neighborhood. I sat on my porch, arms crossed, coffee getting cold in my hands as thick raindrops hammered the roof, and the lawn started soaking up the water like a big muddy sponge. Normally, the creek would have handled it just fine, swallowed all that runoff, carried it downstream like it had done for longer than any of us had been here. But this time, there was no creek to catch the water. Just that long concrete scar, slick and useless. I watched as the water hit the channel, swirled around unsure of what to do, then started backing up, spreading out across the yard like an old man who forgot how to get home. Within an hour, puddles were all over my backyard, gray and ugly like bruises. By noon, the sidewalk out front was ankle-deep in murky water. Bits of mulch and trash were spinning around in lazy circles where the storm drains had clogged up. Across the street, Marie was standing on her porch, holding this huge umbrella, the kind that looked more like a beach tent, watching the water creep up to the curbs and flower beds with a look of smug satisfaction on her face. It only took 2 storms for the real problems to show up. Mrs. Jensen at the corner woke up to squishy carpet in her basement. Mr. Alvarez had to sandbag his front door when runoff turned into a river and came rushing down the slope of his yard. The gutters on Maple Drive overflowed so bad that the whole cul-de-sac turned into a swamp, trapping a couple of cars in dirty, brown water. And every time, without fail, the HOA sent out notices blaming the homeowners: improper lawn grading, clogged personal drains, failure to maintain property water runoff according to HOA standards. Never once did Marie or anyone in the HOA mention the fact that they'd wrecked the whole drainage system by pouring concrete right into the creek's natural path. It was like the creek had never even existed. Like they'd erased it from memory, the same way you'd wipe away a guilty footprint at a crime scene. I didn't say a word. I showed up at the meetings, nodded along when they passed around satellite photos with red circles highlighting all the problem areas, and watched as they passed new emergency measures requiring mandatory property drainage inspections for a cool $250 per household. I played dumb. But inside, I was keeping track of everything, every storm, every flood. I walked the neighborhood with my old Nikon camera slung around my neck, acting like a photographer for fun while secretly taking hundreds of photos. Flooded yards, mailboxes half submerged, water pooling around the newly landscaped areas. I kept a notebook too, jotting down dates, times, locations, and notes on which houses got hit the hardest. After the bigger storms, I even started flying my old drone, capturing aerial shots of the damage. The way the water moved, or more like didn't move, told you everything you needed to know. But no one really noticed. Everyone was too wrapped up in their own arguments. As the flooding got worse, so did the tension. Mrs. Jensen blamed the Alvarez kids for blocking the storm drain with a soccer ball. The Hendersons pointed fingers at the Patels, saying their new flower bed had redirected water onto their lawn. Folks who used to swap barbecue recipes and share beers were now filing formal complaints against each other for intentional water mismanagement. And of course, the HOA leaned right into the drama. They put Marie in charge of some fancy-sounding flood mitigation task force, which was basically just an excuse for her to crank out even more aggressive violation letters and push through emergency fines. No votes, no discussion. Just signatures and punishments. Meanwhile, the drainage system underneath us? Yeah, that was falling apart. Those few old storm drains weren't designed to carry the entire neighborhood's runoff without help from the natural creek. And without it, the system choked, like a guy trying to suck air through a cocktail straw. The streets started cracking. Lawns washed out. Mold crawled up the sides of garage doors. But somehow, every single time, the blame ended up right back at the feet of the homeowners. One morning at the mailbox, I overheard a neighbor mutter, "Maybe Marie ought to fine herself for not controlling the weather." I just nodded, handed him his mail, and slipped another printed stack of photos into my growing file of evidence. It wasn't just the floodwater rising anymore. It was something heavier, resentment. Thick, sour, and bubbling just beneath the surface, like steam pushing against a cracked kettle lid. You could see it in how folks stopped looking each other in the eye during HOA meetings. Hear it in the whispered conversations that would cut off the second certain board members walked by. And Marie? She was soaking it all up. She walked around flashing that HOA badge like it was some kind of sheriff's star. Every new complaint, every new fine handed down to homes she didn't like, she acted like it was a trophy. She even made a little surprise visit to my door one afternoon, gave me her best fake smile and said, due to ongoing drainage concerns, I now had to submit a full landscaping plan for review by the end of the month. I asked her, real calm-like, whether the plan should include the giant slab of concrete they dumped on my property without permission. She just blinked slow and said any changes to existing drainage structures could lead to additional fines. I smiled, signed the form, and added it to my thick, growing binder, the one I'd started calling my ammo box. Let them dig their own hole. I was patient. I had time. And I knew something they didn't. Nature doesn't forget. Water doesn't forgive. And concrete, no matter how smug and permanent it seems, Doesn't stand a chance against the steady pull of rain and gravity. The cracks were already there, if you knew where to look. I saw it in the slow slump of Mr. Alvarez's retaining wall, in that growing puddle that refused to dry out at the bottom of the Hendersons' driveway, in how Mrs. Jensen's yard looked like it was starting to tilt toward the road after that last big storm. The ground was shifting, quiet, steady, like a cat moving just before the pounce. And it was all because they tried to pave over something that was never meant to be controlled. Kept my head down, kept my mouth shut, kept my camera batteries charged. It wasn't just me they'd wronged anymore. It was all of us. And when everything finally came crashing down, I wanted a front row seat. The third week of rain kicked off soft, like a drum roll, just a whisper tapping against the windows. But it didn't stay quiet for long. That gentle tapping grew into a full-on roar, turning the sky pitch black and filling the air with the thick, earthy scent of rain and ozone. Every news channel lit up with warnings, calling it a once-in-a-century storm, a freak mix of cold fronts, oversaturated ground, and bad luck. But in our neighborhood, it felt less like weather and more like Judgment Day. Overnight, the streets turned to rivers. The asphalt vanished under swirling gray water, full of floating sod and shredded mulch. Manhole covers shot brown geysers into the air. Gutters ripped off houses with loud, metallic shrieks. Everything, the roads, the lawns, the homes, just buckled under the weight of the water. Front yards disappeared under grimy lakes that shimmered under the streetlights like oil slicks. And then the houses started to give. At first, it was small stuff, little cracks tracing across driveways and sidewalks. Easy to ignore if you squinted, maybe chalk it up to the usual settling. But then the real damage started to show. Big, jagged fractures crawling up stucco walls like veins of lightning. Door frames twisting so badly that front doors wouldn't even close. Garage floors rising and cracking as the ground shifted beneath them. I watched it all from my porch, sitting in the same old folding chair, holding the same dented thermos of coffee, quietly watching nature take back what it was owed. Across the street, Marie stood ankle-deep in floodwater, yelling into her phone and flailing her arms at what used to be her award-winning rose bushes. Now, they were drowning in a lake that was slowly creeping up her front steps. Her picture-perfect suburb was sinking back into the swamp it used to be, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Not that she didn't try. The HOA scrambled like panicked ants after a kicked nest. Emergency meetings popped up at the community center. They handed out sandbags from the back of some rented U-Haul. Urgent emails flew around blaming everything from clogged city drains to mysterious, unseasonal tides. They hired a landscaping crew that specialized in rapid water remediation, which turned out to be dumping loads of gravel into puddles and hoping for a miracle. Marie led the charge, of course. She filed complaints with the city, threatened legal action, ranted about how their taxes had to entitle them to better drainage. But the truth hung heavy in the air, unspoken but obvious to anyone paying attention. Everybody knew where it started. It started where the creek used to be. It started in my backyard. So naturally, the blame circled right back around. At first, it was whispered among the board during their little panic sessions. Then it showed up in passive-aggressive neighborhood emails. And finally, Marie came marching up my steps with a clipboard and a violation notice thicker than an old phone book. Negligent property maintenance. Failure to install approved drainage systems. Contributing to community-wide flooding. She read each charge aloud, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. Rainwater still dripped from the hem of her fancy designer coat. I just sat there, calm as ever, sipping my coffee, nodding when it seemed polite. I let her get it all out, every ounce of panic, blame, and fury she had stored up. I didn't sign a thing. I didn't say a word. Just gave her that slow smile, the one that always made her eyes narrow, like she knew I was holding on to something she didn't. And I was. I'd been sitting on it for weeks, keeping quiet, waiting like a trapdoor spider for the right moment. They thought they could erase a creek with some concrete and a few forms shoved through the HOA. But real creeks? They don't go away that easy. They're carved into the bones of the land, etched deeper than any survey or neighborhood covenant. The water hadn't vanished. It had just gone underground, slipping through the soil, following the paths it had known for generations. Layer by layer, it soaked the ground until the earth couldn't take it anymore. The cracks weren't just from blocked drains or heavy rain. They were coming from deep below. The ground was swollen with water, pushing back against everything we tried to force on it, cracking foundations, warping driveways, shifting walls. And I had the proof. Tucked away in my files were drone shots showing the early pooling. Overhead maps that traced the water's slow return toward the lower parts of the neighborhood. Old city floodplain maps, never updated after the HOA illegally paved over the creek. I even had quiet, off-the-record recordings of contractors and surveyors confirming what I already knew. The HOA had broken several county drainage laws. But I wasn't ready to spring the trap, not yet. No, it had to get worse. It had to sting. It had to crack them open. And from the looks of things, we were almost there. You could feel it. Like the heavy air before a storm, the static just waiting to explode. Neighbors scowled at each other from across flooded driveways. Arguments at HOA meetings started sharp and ended with shouting. Once perfect lawns had sunk into soggy, resentful messes. Marie could feel it too. That tension. So she went into overdrive. More fines. More inspections. More rules. She formed some kind of neighborhood improvement committee, tasked with identifying which homes were bringing down the look of the community. Guess whose name landed right at the top? I laughed when the notice came in. 3 pages of vague complaints and veiled threats. I slid it straight into the binder, then made a copy and tucked it into a waterproof box I'd buried beneath the old oak in my backyard, just in case. Because people like Marie? When they start losing control, they get desperate. And desperate people make sloppy, dangerous mistakes. All I had to do was wait. The land was already doing the hard part. You could see it in sagging front porches that used to stand proud. In warped fences and split retaining walls. You could hear it in the uneasy conversations at the cafe, the quiet whispers at mailboxes, the way for sale signs were popping up like mushrooms after a downpour. This neighborhood was rotting from the inside out, just like Marie's little kingdom of paperwork and power trips. And somehow, she still believed she could fine me into giving up. That all of this, all the mess, was about me. That was her biggest mistake. This was never about me. It was about the land, the water, about forces that were older, stronger, and way more patient than Marie could ever wrap her head around. And soon enough, she was going to learn that lesson the hard way. There was a heavy envelope, one I'd kept buried at the bottom of my filing cabinet for years, right between some faded instruction manuals and an old box of busted Christmas lights I never bothered to hang. I found it the night after Marie dropped off her latest violation notice. Her smug little smirk was still burned into my memory. Honestly, it was pure stubbornness that sent me into the garage that night. Flashlight clenched between my teeth, digging through old boxes like a raccoon on a mission, until I finally pulled out that beat-up blue folder my granddad gave me when he handed over the property. "Might come in handy someday," he'd said. And then, like every old man who knew something, he refused to say anything more. I used a screwdriver to pry open the envelope inside, and what I found was gold. Original land surveys dating all the way back to 1952. A certified letter from the County Water Authority dated 1978, confirming there was a permanent natural drainage easement that ran straight through what was now my backyard. Even state-level environmental protection documents, identifying the creek as part of a legally protected watershed. In short, rock-solid proof. That little creek wasn't just some pretty backyard feature. It was a protected drainage channel, and nobody, not even a power-drunk HOA, had the right to block, fill, or reroute it. And that's exactly what they'd done when they buried it in concrete. I sat there on the cold garage floor, the papers laid out in front of me like a royal flush, and just let out a long breath. They had really screwed up. But proving it wasn't as simple as waving some papers at the next HOA meeting. I needed the right eyes on this. People with authority. People who could shut Marie down the same way a dam shuts down a flood. So I started making calls. First up was the County Water Authority. I requested a property inspection, framed it as a concern about unauthorized drainage modifications. Next, I called the city's environmental office. Told them I was worried there might be a wetlands violation. I gave my real name, real address. But I didn't mention the HOA. Not yet. Better to let them stumble across the mess themselves. While the red tape machine got moving, I kicked off the second phase of my plan, anonymous whistleblowing. It was easier than I thought. Just took a burner email and some careful wording. I wrote up a clean, anonymous report, laid it all out. Attached drone shots, time-stamped pictures of the concrete pour, scans of those old easement papers, and links to the county codes they were breaking. I sent it to every local news station, the city paper, a few big Facebook groups in the area, and, just for fun, the HOA gossip forum that Marie banned me from last year. Then I waited. Didn't take long. 3 days later, a white truck from the county rolled slowly down the street, followed by another with the city seal stamped on the door. 2 inspectors climbed out, one with a clipboard, the other lugging a surveyor's tripod. They stepped carefully across the muddy sidewalk, avoided the flooded lawns, and headed straight to my door. I let them in, offered them coffee, and laid everything out, calm, clear, by the book. I didn't rant. Just showed them the evidence. They listened, asked a few sharp questions, then spent the next 4 hours inspecting the old creek bed. They measured the concrete, took soil samples, and snapped photos from every possible angle. I sat out on my porch and watched them. They took notes, whispered, frowned, a lot, and eventually, they climbed back into their trucks, both of them shaking their heads as they drove off. Later that evening, the first news segment aired. Just a short one on the local channel. But there it was, a blurry aerial shot of our neighborhood, floating on what looked like a shallow lake. Muddy water spreading like a slow disaster. The reporter's voice explained how unapproved changes to natural drainage systems had likely made the flooding worse, and might have broken more than a few environmental laws. They hadn't named the HOA yet, but I knew that was coming. The very next morning, I pulled a certified letter from my mailbox, an official notice of investigation. It was addressed to the HOA, not to me. But Marie already knew. I could tell by the way she stormed into that emergency board meeting later that day. I hung around just long enough to see her make a dramatic entrance. Cheeks red, hair all frizzed up from the rain, storming up to the podium like a woman on fire. She slapped a thick stack of papers down in front of the board like she was slamming a gavel in court. She started ranting about slander, lies, community sabotage. Said rogue residents were trying to destroy everything they'd built. She accused the county of overreach, the city of playing politics, the media of pushing some agenda. She blamed everyone but herself. And right behind her, the projector screen blinked on. There it was, images pulled straight from the whistleblower packet. Photos of the cement truck dumping into what used to be my creek. Maps showing the protected easement running directly through my yard. Screenshots of county codes, highlighted in bold red. Plain as day. You could have heard a pin drop. The only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the AC. Even the board members, usually so quick to nod along with everything Marie said, squirmed in their chairs. Eyes dropped to the floor. Some looked at each other, searching for a way out of the mess. Marie knew she was cornered. You could see it in her face. But she wasn't the type to back down. She claimed the concrete had been a temporary fix for erosion. Claimed the HOA had every right to improve common spaces. Even hinted that someone at the county gave her verbal permission to do it. Then one of the quieter board members spoke up, asked real carefully if she had that in writing. That shut her up fast. Because she didn't. And we all knew it. That night, round 2 hit the news, and this time, it hit hard. The tone had changed. Reporters used words like illegal, reckless, and potential civil and criminal penalties. Residents started going on camera, furious about what had happened, worried about their homes, their foundations, their property values. A local environmental group got involved. They launched a petition demanding a full investigation and compensation for anyone affected. It didn't take long before official violation notices were taped to the doors of the community center like scarlet letters. City inspectors started showing up, not with HOA fines, but with clipboards, asking to check people's basements and foundations. Lawsuits started bubbling up in the background. Rumors spread fast. Some homeowners were preparing to sue the HOA and individual board members for negligence and property damage. And right in the center of the chaos stood Marie, frantically trying to patch holes in a ship that was already halfway sunk. She tried rallying her loyalists, the last few hardcore rule followers who still believed in the almighty HOA, but even they were fading fast, one flooded crawlspace at a time. She tried spinning it all, playing the victim, claiming conspiracy. But no one was buying it anymore. The same neighbors who used to nod along during her rants were now crossing the street just to avoid her. Board meetings that once filled every folding chair in the room were now struggling to even meet quorum. Her little empire of rules and fines? It was falling apart. Marie had no clue how to stop it. I sat on my porch and watched the whole thing unravel, sipping my coffee, flipping through the ever-growing stack of news clippings and legal notices with a kind of quiet satisfaction. Because sure, once upon a time, Marie held the HOA in a death grip. But now, the county, the city, the media, and the law, they had her by the ankles, dragging her down inch by inch. She'd built her little empire on arrogance and asphalt, poured all her confidence into concrete. And in doing that, she forgot the oldest rule in the book. Nature always wins. And this time, it was winning big. The first batch of citations from the city hit like thunder. Thick official envelopes stuffed into every HOA board member's mailbox, each stamped with heavy government letterhead and legal wording sharp enough to cut steel. I didn't get to see Marie open hers, but I wish I had. I would have paid money for that. The real moment, though, came later that same afternoon, when city workers started posting red tags on a dozen front doors, including hers. Unsafe structure, unstable foundation, immediate occupancy restrictions pending remediation. In plain English, their dream homes had just been declared unsafe to live in. I watched from my porch as families stood out in the drizzle, staring at those bright orange warning signs like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. They looked like people waking up inside a bad dream. Within days, moving vans lined the street, engines idling while confused homeowners tried to salvage what they could from houses sinking into the earth like slow-motion shipwrecks. Marie didn't go quietly. She lawyered up, threatened lawsuits, yelled at city inspectors from her driveway until her voice gave out. But none of it mattered. The damage was everywhere. The evidence stacked high. And the paper trail of negligence was thicker than the mud swallowing their yards. Then came the final blow, from the insurance companies. The first claims came in, water damage, collapsed foundations, mold issues. But the adjusters? They weren't there to help. They were there to shut it all down. Negligence, they said. Policy violations. Improper drainage maintenance. Claim after claim, denied. No money. No repairs. No recovery. Without the insurance payouts, everyone was stuck. Their homes were worthless. Their mortgages bleeding them dry. Foreclosure notices started showing up in windows like little paper ghosts. Even Marie's home, the showpiece of the whole neighborhood, with its manicured bushes and fake Greek columns, was condemned outright. By the end of the month, she was living in a borrowed RV, parked at the far end of the subdivision. The tires slowly sinking into the same muddy mess she'd set in motion. Not long after that, the HOA fell apart completely. They held one last emergency meeting inside the gutted community center. Only a few residents bothered to show up. We took a vote to dissolve the HOA for good. No speeches. No applause. Just a bunch of tired, rain-soaked hands raised in agreement. Marie tried to object. Nobody listened. It was over and she knew it. They read the final financial report in a voice so flat and broken it might as well have been a funeral dirge. Over $2.3 million in projected legal liabilities. 0 assets. Bankruptcy on the horizon. A motion was made, seconded, and passed to dissolve the HOA, effective immediately. The last anyone saw of Marie, she was hauling boxes of shredded documents out of the community center, with a city marshal standing just a few steps behind her. But that wasn't the end of it. Because even as the HOA collapsed in its well-deserved death, the neighborhood was left with a choice: try to patch up the broken system like before, or finally listen to the land and return to the way things were meant to be. The vote to bring back the natural drainage passed almost without argument. The county's environmental office stepped in with grants to support watershed restoration. Volunteers came out in droves. Even some of the folks who once looked down their noses at me showed up ready to help. For weeks, we dug, hauled, and planted, pulling up the concrete like peeling away an old scab, letting the earth underneath finally breathe again. We didn't use pipes or pumps or asphalt. We followed the land's lead, guiding the water with native grasses, willow saplings, and carefully placed stones. And the first time that creek flowed again, clean and clear, laughing as it wound through my yard, it felt like hearing a long-lost friend call my name. I sat by the bank with my legs dipped in the cool current, smiling as the dragonflies came back. Frogs croaked from the reeds. The whole place seemed to let out a slow, grateful breath. But I wasn't quite done yet. One bright, quiet morning, while the neighborhood buzzed with the sounds of rebuilding, I walked to the head of the creek where it curved into my property. I carried a small wooden sign I'd carved myself, every letter whittled slow and careful until the words stood out bold and honest. Nature always wins. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't gloating. It was just the truth. Because for all their rules, their fines, their concrete and smug declarations, they'd forgotten something. The oldest rule there is. You can't beat the land. Not forever. No matter how high you build your fences, how many forms you fill out, how official your stamps look, it remembers. It waits. And when the time is right, it takes back what's its own. Marie packed up not long after that. No goodbye party. No teary speeches. Just her old RV hitched to a dented pickup with a busted rear window, crawling out of the neighborhood while a few folks watched from behind their curtains, breathing quiet sighs of relief. The house she once ruled over like a queen? It stood empty now, half-sunken, crumbling, slowly being swallowed by the very swamp she helped create. A sad little monument to arrogance and poor judgment. The new families who moved in didn't ask much about the past. They saw the creek flowing again, the trees thriving, the gardens blooming. And that was enough. They let the land tell its own story, a better story, one that could last. Now and then I still find myself out there, sitting by the creek at sunset. I watch the light dance on the water, listen to the frogs sing, feel the solid, steady ground beneath my boots. Sometimes I run my fingers over the rough wood of that sign and smile, because I remember what it took to get here. And I know this. No matter who comes next, no matter who tries to tame it, control it, or carve it up, the land will remember. It always does. And when the time comes, it will win, just like it always has.